The autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle. As members of the royal family gathered for what was meant to be a routine public appearance, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood near the stone balustrade, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of her youngest son. Prince Louis, the 5-year-old, had been remarkably well behaved during the first hour of the event. But anyone who knew children understood that such good behavior had its limits. Louis tugged at his mother's hand, his small face scrunched with the particular brand of determination that only young children possess. When they've decided something is absolutely necessary, Catherine leaned down, her glossy brown hair falling forward as she listened to whatever urgent matter her son needed to communicate. The princess smiled, that practiced public smile that conveyed warmth while maintaining appropriate dignity, and gently guided Louis back toward the designated family area. Camilla, the queen consort, stood several feet away, engaged in conversation with a military official whose chest displayed an impressive array of medals and ribbons. Her cream-colored suit caught the afternoon light, and she gestured elegantly as she spoke about the military charities she patronized. The official nodded respectfully, clearly honored to have her undivided attention. Unaware of the small drama beginning to unfold nearby, Prince Louis had spotted something fascinating. To an adult, it might have been nothing more than a ceremonial sword displayed as part of the military exhibit. But to a curious 5-year-old, it represented the height of interest. He pulled away from his mother's grasp with the surprising strength children can summon when properly motivated. Darting across the grass with the speed of someone who knew he had only seconds before being recaptured, Catherine called his name softly but firmly. Unwilling to create a scene, but equally unwilling to let her youngest child run wild at a formal royal engagement, she moved after him, her heels clicking against the stone pathway as she transitioned from grass to pavement. Other members of the royal household noticed the small commotion, their expressions carefully neutral as they pretended not to see the very human moment of a mother chasing her energetic child. Louis's trajectory would have taken him directly past Camilla, who remained focused on her conversation, unaware of the approaching whirlwind in small formal wear. The child had no intention of disrupting his step-grandmother, but his path would bring him within inches of where she stood. Catherine quickened her pace, one hand reaching forward, her expression mixing embarrassment with the universal exasperation of parents everywhere. The royal guard on duty that afternoon was a decorated officer named Thomas Whitfield, a man whose 20-year military career had prepared him for threats both obvious and subtle. He stood at his assigned position, back straight, eyes constantly scanning the gathered crowd and the royal family members he was sworn to protect. Whitfield had served in protection details for numerous royal events, and he understood that danger could come from unexpected directions. From his vantage point, Whitfield saw Prince Louis break free from his mother's supervision. He watched the child's trajectory, calculated the speed, and recognized immediately that the young prince would cross directly into the queen consort's space. Camilla, still engaged in her discussion, had not noticed the incoming child. The military official she spoke with had his back to Louis's approach and would provide no warning. In the split second available to him, Whitfield made a decision. He couldn't call out without drawing unwanted attention to the situation. He couldn't grab the child, as physically restraining a member of the royal family, even a 5-year-old one, violated numerous protocols. What he could do was create a physical barrier, a human wall that would intercept the prince's path without causing alarm or injury. Whitfield moved with the fluid precision of his military training. 3 quick steps brought him to a position directly between Camilla and the approaching Prince Louis. He didn't reach for the child, didn't speak, simply positioned himself as an obstacle that required navigation. His face remained professionally blank, his posture perfect, giving no indication that anything unusual was occurring. Prince Louis, running at full speed, suddenly found his path blocked by a tall figure in dress uniform. The child skidded to a halt with the graceless efficiency of young children, his small shoes scraping against the stone. He looked up at the guard towering above him, his expression shifting from determination to surprise. For a moment, child and guard regarded each other in silence. Catherine reached them a heartbeat later, slightly breathless, her cheeks flushed with exertion and embarrassment. She placed her hands on Lewis's shoulders, steadying him, and looked up at Whitfield with an expression that conveyed both gratitude and apology. The guard gave the smallest of nods, acknowledging the princess without breaking his formal bearing. The entire incident had taken perhaps 5 seconds from start to finish. Camilla turned at that moment, her conversation with the military official reaching a natural pause. She saw Catherine with Louis, saw the guard standing at attention, and her experienced eye immediately understood that something had just occurred. Her expression remained pleasant, but a flicker of curiosity crossed her features. The military official followed her gaze, equally puzzled by the tableau before them. The queen consort smiled warmly at her step-grandson and daughter-in-law. Whatever had happened, it was clearly resolved. She extended a gracious hand toward Louis, who had calmed considerably now that his adventure had been curtailed. The child looked up at his step-grandmother, then back at the impressive guard who had blocked his path. Clearly trying to decide if he should be upset about this turn of events, other observers began to take notice now. Photographers positioned around the event's perimeter adjusted their cameras, hoping to capture whatever was unfolding. Royal correspondents exchanged glances, their professional instincts detecting a story in the making. Staff members moved slightly closer, ready to intervene if necessary, though they maintained appropriate distance. Catherine spoke quietly to Prince Louis, her words inaudible to those standing more than a few feet away, but her tone carried the universal sound of a mother explaining behavioral expectations to her child. Louis listened with the solemn attention children give when they know they've pushed boundaries but aren't quite sure of the consequences. His small hand found his mother's and he squeezed it, a gesture of both reassurance and subtle apology. Whitfield remained in position, his presence now serving multiple purposes. He was still technically performing his duty as security, but his positioning also provided a subtle privacy screen for the princess and her son. Other guards had shifted almost imperceptibly, creating a loose perimeter that discouraged onlookers from approaching too closely. The coordination happened without spoken commands. It's a result of extensive training and professional experience. Camilla watched the interaction with an expression that was difficult to read. As someone who had raised children and stepchildren of her own, she understood the challenges Catherine faced in raising young royals under constant public scrutiny. At the same time, protocol and propriety mattered at official engagements. The balance between being a warm, loving family and maintaining the dignity expected of the monarchy required constant navigation. The queen consort took a step toward Catherine and Louis, her movement prompting immediate attention from everyone nearby. She moved with the particular grace that came from decades in the public eye, each gesture calculated to appear natural while serving a specific purpose. The military official she'd been conversing with stepped back respectfully, recognizing that family matters were taking precedence over their discussion. When Camilla reached Catherine, she placed a gentle hand on the younger woman's arm. The gesture appeared affectionate, supportive even, but it also established a physical connection that the cameras would capture. Whatever words were exchanged between the two women happened in voices too low for others to hear, but body language told part of the story. Catherine's posture relaxed slightly, suggesting relief. Camilla's smile seemed genuine, reaching her eyes. Prince Louis, standing between the two women, looked up at his step-grandmother with wide eyes. Camilla bent slightly, bringing herself closer to the child's eye level, and said something that made Louis giggle. The sound, pure and uninhibited, cut through the formal atmosphere like sunlight through clouds. Several nearby observers smiled despite themselves. Charmed by the child's unself-conscious joy, Thomas Whitfield maintained his position, though he'd adjusted his stance slightly to appear less like a barrier and more like standard security presence. His eyes continued their constant scanning of the surroundings, but a portion of his attention remained on the royal family members nearby. The situation had de-escalated, but his training taught him that apparent calm could shift rapidly. A senior household official approached the group, her demeanor professional but warm. Lady Margaret Thornberry had served the royal family for 15 years and had witnessed countless small crises resolved with grace and discretion. She spoke briefly with both Catherine and Camilla, her presence serving to further normalize the situation. 2 onlookers. It appeared to be nothing more than a pleasant conversation among family members and staff. The photographers continued capturing images, their cameras clicking in rapid succession. They'd witnessed something, though its exact nature remained unclear. A child running? A guard intervening? The princess retrieving her son? The queen consort joining them? Each element seemed innocuous individually, but collectively they hinted at a story. Royal correspondents would spend hours later analyzing every frame, constructing narratives from fragments of frozen moments. Louis, apparently deciding that the exciting part of the afternoon had concluded, leaned against his mother's leg with the sudden exhaustion that overtakes children after bursts of intense energy. Catherine stroked his hair absently, her attention now divided between her son and the conversation with Camilla and Lady Thornberry. The princess's expression had shifted from embarrassed concern to something more relaxed. Suggesting that whatever needed to be said had been said, Camilla gestured toward the display that had originally attracted Louis's attention, the ceremonial sword that had sparked his impromptu dash across the lawn. She said something to the military official who had been standing nearby, and he immediately moved toward the display. Within moments, he returned carrying a smaller, clearly replica sword designed for demonstrations and educational purposes. He presented it to Louis with formal ceremony. Going down on one knee, as if presenting arms to royalty, the child's face lit up with delight. He looked up at his mother for permission, and Catherine nodded, though her expression suggested this reward might come with conditions to be discussed later. Louis accepted the replica sword with both hands, holding it carefully as the official explained something about its history and significance. The boy listened with rapt attention, his earlier wildness channeled into focused interest. Whitfield watched this development with carefully concealed approval. The situation had transformed from potential disruption into an educational moment that would photograph well and reinforce the family's connection to military traditions. It was, he reflected, a masterful bit of public relations management. Whether intentionally orchestrated or simply the result of experienced royals knowing how to turn awkward moments into opportunities, the gathered crowd, which had grown during the small drama, now pressed closer again, their earlier concern replaced with warm interest. Parents in the audience smiled knowingly, recognizing the universal experience of managing energetic children in public spaces. Military personnel present appreciated seeing their future king interacting with military traditions. Even if that interaction had begun with an unauthorized sprint across the lawn, Catherine caught Whitfield's eye and mouthed a clear, "Thank you." The guard responded with the slightest inclination of his head, a gesture so small that only someone watching carefully would notice. It was an acknowledgement between two people who had navigated a delicate situation successfully, each playing their role with professionalism and discretion. The afternoon continued with renewed smoothness after the brief disruption. Prince Louis, now armed with his replica sword and having received attention from both his mother and step-grandmother, seemed content to remain close to Catherine's side. The toy weapon occupied his hands and attention, giving him something to focus on besides the various temptations a large public gathering might otherwise present to a curious 5-year-old. Camilla returned to her official duties. Moving through the crowd with practiced ease, she stopped to speak with veterans, their families, and representatives from various military charities. Her interaction with Louis had softened her demeanor somehow, made her seem more approachable. People who might have felt intimidated approaching the queen consort found themselves drawn to her warm smiles and genuine interest in their stories. Thomas. Whitfield resumed his standard security position, though he remained more alert than usual to the movements of the youngest prince. His intervention had been noticed by his superior officers, and he'd received a brief nod of approval from the head of the security detail. In the world of royal protection, such acknowledgement was high praise. His quick thinking had prevented what could have been an awkward collision and potential injury, all while maintaining the dignity of the occasion. Catherine, meanwhile, had been approached by several guests who wanted to express their sympathy for the challenges of managing young children at formal events. She handled these interactions with grace, neither dismissing their concerns nor dwelling on the incident. Her responses struck the perfect balance between acknowledging the reality of parenting and maintaining the mystique expected of royalty. She made it look effortless, though anyone who understood public life knew how much work went into appearing so natural. Lady Thornberry circulated through the event, quietly ensuring that everyone understood the official perspective on what had occurred. In her capable hands, the narrative became a charming story of a child's innocent curiosity, a guard's quick thinking, and a family's warmth. She emphasized the educational aspect of Louis's interest in military traditions, turning what might have been seen as misbehavior into an example of natural princely interest in the armed forces. The military official, who had presented the replica sword to Louis, found himself unexpectedly popular. Other guests approached him to ask about the interaction, and he described it in terms that emphasized the young prince's respectful interest and quick intelligence. He mentioned how Louis had asked surprisingly sophisticated questions about the sword's history and use, details that would make excellent copy for the royal correspondents filing their stories later. As the event progressed, the earlier tension dissolved completely. What had seemed like it might become a difficult moment had instead transformed into one of the day's highlights. Photographers had their charming images of Louis with his sword. Correspondents had their human interest angle about the challenges and joys of royal family life. Security personnel had a successful intervention to note in their after-action reports. Prince Louis, for his part, seemed to have forgotten entirely about his earlier dash for freedom. He stood beside his mother, occasionally swinging his replica sword in carefully controlled arcs that wouldn't endanger anyone nearby. Catherine kept a gentle hand on his shoulder, a reminder of her presence and expectations, but her touch was light, affectionate rather than restrictive. Camilla passed by the pair during her circulation through the crowd. She paused to admire Louise's sword. The child eagerly showed her the details the military official had pointed out, his small voice rising with enthusiasm as he explained what he'd learned. The queen consort listened attentively, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest while also being perfectly pitched to a 5-year-old's level of understanding. The exchange between Camilla and Louis was captured by multiple photographers, and the images would later be described as heartwarming examples of the blended family's harmony. In the photographs, Louis looked up at his step-grandmother with complete trust and excitement, while Camilla's expression showed patient affection. Catherine stood slightly behind them, her face reflecting maternal pride and relief. Whitfield observed this interaction from his position, and something in his professionally neutral expression might have suggested satisfaction. His job was to protect the royal family from threats, but threats came in many forms. A 5-year-old's enthusiastic sprint might not seem dangerous, but a collision with the queen consort, however accidental, could have resulted in injury, embarrassment, or diplomatic awkwardness within the family. His intervention had prevented all those possibilities. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the Windsor grounds in golden light. The event was reaching its natural conclusion, with guests beginning to make their respectful departures. Royal family members prepared for the final portion of the appearance, a group photograph that would commemorate the occasion. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency, ensuring everyone was positioned correctly. For the photograph, Louis was placed between Catherine and Camilla. The child stood straight, his replica sword held at his side in a surprisingly good approximation of military bearing. The photographer called out instructions, coaxing smiles from the assembled group. When the session concluded, Louis's formal posture dissolved immediately, and he sagged against his mother with the exhaustion of a child who had been on his best behavior for as long as he could manage. Camilla reached over and ruffled Louis's hair gently, a gesture of affection that seemed to surprise the child. He looked up at her with a smile, and she winked at him, a small conspiracy between step-grandmother and step-grandson. Catherine watched this exchange with an expression that mixed gratitude and something more complex, perhaps recognition of the careful balancing act. They all performed as the royal family began their departure from the public area. Whitfield and his fellow security personnel formed their practiced escort positions. The guard who had intervened earlier found himself walking parallel to the group, close enough to respond to any situation but far enough to provide the family with space. He caught Catherine's eye one final time, and she smiled at him. A genuine expression of thanks that transcended their different roles and stations. The following morning brought what Thomas Whitfield had expected but not particularly desired: attention. The story of his intervention had made its way into several newspapers and online publications, though the accounts varied wildly in their accuracy. Some portrayed him as having physically prevented a collision. Others suggested he'd caught the young prince mid-sprint, and a few creative interpretations implied dramatic rescue from unspecified danger. Whitfield sat in his small apartment, drinking coffee and reading the various accounts with a mixture of amusement and concern. The attention was professionally awkward. Good security work typically happened invisibly, with successful interventions preventing incidents before they became newsworthy. Having his name and photograph circulated in connection with a royal event, even a positive one, made him uncomfortable. It drew attention to the security apparatus that worked best when unnoticed. His phone had rung several times already that morning. Fellow guards and military colleagues called to congratulate him or tease him about his sudden fame. His mother had called, simultaneously proud and worried, asking if the attention would create problems for his career. His sister sent a text with a link to a particularly dramatic headline, accompanied by several laughing emojis and the message, asking if he'd really saved the entire royal family from catastrophe. At Kensington Palace, Catherine was having her own morning debriefing about the previous day's events. Her private secretary had prepared a summary of the media coverage highlighting the various narratives that had emerged. Most coverage was positive, praising the guards' quick thinking and the family's warm interactions. A few commentators questioned whether Louis's behavior reflected poorly on his parents' discipline, but these voices were largely drowned out by those who found the incident charming. The princess read through the summaries with careful attention. She was particularly interested in how Camilla had been portrayed in the various accounts. The relationship between herself and the queen consort existed under constant media scrutiny, with commentators eager to detect or invent tension where none necessarily existed. The previous day's events could have been spun as conflict or correction, but instead most coverage emphasized cooperation and family warmth. Catherine made a note to personally thank Camilla for her gracious handling of the situation. While the incident itself had been minor, the queen consort's response had set the tone for how everyone else reacted, by treating it as a charming family moment rather than a breach of protocol. Camilla had demonstrated both kindness and political savvy. The note would be handwritten, personal, acknowledging the gesture that might have seemed small but carried significant weight. At Clarence House, Camilla was having her own breakfast while reviewing similar media summaries. She smiled at some of the more creative interpretations of events, particularly those that invented dramatic details nowhere in evidence. The truth was simple enough. A child had run toward an interesting object. A guard had prevented disruption, and family members had handled it with appropriate grace. The elaborate narratives some outlets constructed from these basic facts demonstrated how hungry the media remained for royal drama. The queen consort had genuinely enjoyed her interaction with Louis the previous day. Her own grandchildren were growing older, moving past the age of uninhibited enthusiasm that made young children so entertaining. Louis's excitement about the sword, his unself-conscious joy, had been refreshing. She made a mental note to arrange more informal family gatherings where the children could simply be children without the weight of constant formality. She also thought about Catherine, recognizing the particular pressures the younger woman faced. Raising children in the public eye had always been challenging for royal parents. The modern media environment made it exponentially more difficult. Every parenting decision faced immediate public judgment. Every childhood stumble became fodder for endless analysis. Camilla resolved to be more openly supportive, to make it clear that she understood these challenges and stood ready to help however she could. Thomas Whitfield's day continued with an unexpected summons to meet with senior members of the royal household. He arrived at the designated office with some trepidation, uncertain whether the attention his actions had generated would be viewed as helpful or problematic. The distinction mattered professionally. Guards who drew attention to themselves, even for positive reasons, could find their career advancement complicated by concerns about their judgment. The meeting however, proved to be entirely positive. The senior household official who had been present at the event, Lady Thornbury, personally thanked him for his quick thinking and professional discretion. She explained that both the Princess of Wales and the Queen Consort had specifically mentioned his intervention favorably. Rather than creating problems, his actions had prevented what could have been an awkward situation and demonstrated the quality of the security team's training and judgment. Whitfield accepted the praise with appropriate humility, though internally he felt considerable relief. His decision to intervene had been instinctive, based on training and experience, but he'd second-guessed it afterward. Physical intervention in royal family matters, even something as simple as positioning himself as a barrier, involved calculated risk. The positive response from the family members involved validated his judgment and would be noted in his service record. Lady Thornbury also delivered a more unusual message. She explained that Prince Louis had asked about the guard who had stopped him, wanting to know the man's name and whether he might see him again. The child, it seemed, had been impressed by Whitfield's bearing and uniform. Viewing the guard as something between a real-life toy soldier and a friendly giant, Catherine had suggested that if Whitfield was willing, and if protocol permitted, he might be assigned to future family events where his familiar presence might help Louis feel more comfortable and secure. The suggestion surprised Whitfield considerably. Being specifically requested by royal family members for security detail was unusual, particularly based on a single brief interaction. It represented a significant professional opportunity, but also additional responsibility. He would need to maintain the same professional standards while building a rapport with a 5-year-old prince, who might view him as something between a security guard and a fascinating curiosity. He agreed. Of course, the suggestion came from the Princess of Wales, which made it more directive than request regardless of how it was phrased. More importantly, he recognized the trust implicit in the arrangement. The family was comfortable enough with his presence and judgment to want him specifically involved in events involving their youngest child. That trust was something to be earned and maintained, not something to take lightly. The weeks following the Windsor incident brought subtle but noticeable changes to Thomas Whitfield's professional life. He found himself assigned to family events with increasing frequency, particularly those involving the younger Cambridge children. The assignments came without fanfare or official explanation, simply appearing on his duty roster with the same matter-of-fact notation as any other protective detail. Prince Louis, true to the report Whitfield had received, seemed to remember him. At their second encounter, a garden party at Kensington Palace, the young prince's face lit up with recognition. Louis didn't run to him or call out, having apparently received instruction about appropriate behavior around security personnel. But his eyes tracked the guard's movements with obvious interest. Later, when the child needed redirecting away from a flower bed he'd taken interest in exploring, Whitfield's gentle positioning earned a conspiratorial grin from the young prince. Catherine noticed these interactions and felt reassured by them. Having security personnel who could manage her children's occasional exuberance without harshness or excessive formality made public appearances less stressful. Whitfield had a gift for redirecting Louis's energy without making the child feel scolded or diminishing his natural curiosity. The guard treated the prince with appropriate respect for his position while also seeming to understand that he was, ultimately, a small child navigating a very unusual life. The princess made a point of speaking with Whitfield during these events. Brief professional exchanges that acknowledged his role while also expressing appreciation for his handling of her son. These conversations never lasted long, maintaining appropriate boundaries between royal family members and staff. But they established a pattern of communication that benefited everyone involved. Whitfield could provide feedback about security concerns or observations about the children's comfort levels, information that helped Catherine make better decisions about event participation and duration. Camilla, too, had noticed the developing dynamic. She observed Whitfield's interactions with Louis during a memorial service where the families gathered. The young prince had become restless during the lengthy ceremony, his 5-year-old attention span exhausted by speeches and formality. Whitfield, positioned nearby, had caught Louis's eye and stood at exaggerated attention, his face comically serious. The child had giggled quietly, then mimicked the guard's posture, standing straighter and stiller than he had in the previous 20 minutes. The queen consort filed this observation away as evidence that the security team consisted of more than just professionally trained personnel. They were people with intelligence, creativity, and genuine care for the family they protected. She mentioned the incident to King Charles later, describing how a guard had transformed a potential disruption into a teaching moment through nothing more than playful engagement. The king, who valued loyalty and discretion in equal measure, made note of Whitfield's name. Meanwhile, the media attention surrounding the original Windsor incident had largely faded, replaced by newer royal stories and scandals. A few photographs of Louis with his replica sword had become popular on social media, shared by accounts dedicated to royal children with captions about his cuteness and budding interest in military traditions. The narrative had solidified into exactly what Lady Thornbury had hoped: a charming story about a curious child and a professional guard. Nothing more complex or controversial. Whitfield appreciated the return to relative anonymity. The brief surge of attention had been professionally uncomfortable. Even though it had ultimately enhanced his career prospects rather than damaging them, he preferred to do his work without public recognition, protecting the royal family through competence and vigilance rather than dramatic interventions that made headlines. His relationship with Louis continued to develop in small, appropriate ways. The prince began to expect his presence at events, looking for the tall guard with the kind face who seemed to understand when rules could bend slightly, and when they absolutely could not. Whitfield, in turn, learned to read the child's moods and energy levels, recognizing signs of approaching meltdown or overwhelming stimulation. This understanding allowed him to position himself strategically, ready to intervene with distraction or gentle redirection before situations escalated. Catherine discussed this development with William one evening after the children were asleep. Her husband had been traveling during the Windsor incident, but had heard multiple accounts of what transpired. He listened as Catherine described how Whitfield's presence had become quietly beneficial to their public appearances with Louis. The guard never overstepped, never tried to parent or discipline, but his calm presence and occasional playful interactions helped their youngest son navigate the demands of public life. William suggested they arrange some form of official recognition for Whitfield's service. Catherine agreed, but cautioned that the guard seemed uncomfortable with public attention. Perhaps something more private would be appropriate, an acknowledgement that recognized his contribution without subjecting him to renewed media scrutiny. They decided to discuss the matter with senior household staff, seeking advice on how best to express appreciation while respecting Whitfield's apparent preference for remaining in the background. The approach of summer brought a series of outdoor royal events, and Louis's behavior at these gatherings became noticeably more confident. He still required supervision, still occasionally tested boundaries as any 5-year-old would, but the wild unpredictability that had characterized some earlier appearances seemed diminished. Catherine credited several factors: her son's natural maturation, clearer expectations and consequences, and the familiar presence of security personnel he'd learned to trust and even like. At a garden party in early June, Louis approached Whitfield directly for the first time, tugging gently on the guard's uniform sleeve. The interaction was observed by several staff members and a few guests, all curious about how the security officer would handle such direct engagement from the young prince. Whitfield crouched down to Louis's eye level, listening seriously as the child asked a question about the medals on his uniform. The guard spent several minutes explaining each medal's significance in simple terms Louis could understand. He described deployments and service without glorifying violence or frightening the child, focusing instead on concepts like duty, teamwork, and helping others. Louis listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated surprising insight for his age. When the conversation concluded, the prince thanked Whitfield formally, clearly coached in appropriate behavior, then ran off to rejoin his siblings. As autumn returned and the anniversary of the original Windsor incident approached, the event had largely faded from public memory, except as an occasional reference point in articles about Prince Louis's personality and development. The young prince had become known for his spirited nature, his willingness to break from protocol in pursuit of whatever caught his interest. Balanced by moments of surprising maturity and thoughtfulness, Thomas Whitfield's role in the family's security detail had evolved from temporary assignment to something more permanent. While he still rotated through various duties and protected other members of the family, he was now regularly scheduled for events involving the Cambridge children. His superiors recognized his particular skill with the younger royals. His ability to maintain security protocols while also understanding the unique challenges of protecting children who lived under constant public scrutiny. The guard had witnessed Louis's growth over the intervening months, seen the child become more comfortable with public appearances and more aware of expectations. The prince still possessed abundant energy and curiosity, but he'd learned better when to express these traits freely and when to channel them into more formal behavior. Whitfield took no credit for this development, understanding that it resulted primarily from Catherine and William's parenting and the child's own maturation. But he appreciated being part of the supportive structure that made the prince's public life more manageable. Catherine had indeed sent a personal note of thanks to Whitfield months earlier, a handwritten message on official stationery that he'd carefully preserved. The note was brief but warm, acknowledging his professionalism and expressing appreciation for his patience with her youngest son. She'd mentioned that Louis spoke fondly of the guard, viewing him as a friendly presence at events that could sometimes feel overwhelming. The princess wrote that such allies made her job as a mother considerably easier and that she valued his contribution more than formal recognition could adequately express. Camilla's relationship with Louis had also deepened over the intervening months. The Windsor incident had sparked something in their dynamic, a moment of genuine connection that had grown into comfortable affection. The queen consort made efforts to engage with all her step-grandchildren, but she'd developed a particular soft spot for the spirited youngest prince. She appreciated his honesty and enthusiasm, his refusal to be anything other than authentically himself, even in formal settings. The adults in Louis's life had formed an unspoken alliance, focused on helping him navigate the peculiar challenges of being a young royal. Catherine provided consistent parenting and clear expectations. William offered playful engagement balanced with appropriate discipline. Camilla contributed warmth and perspective from her own experience with blended families and public scrutiny. Staff members like Whitfield and Lady Thornbury provided professional support that helped smooth potentially difficult moments. This network of support had been tested repeatedly over the months. Louis had experienced the normal range of childhood emotions and behaviors at public events: tears when tired, laughter at inappropriate moments, fidgeting during long ceremonies, and occasional spectacular displays of stubbornness. Each incident was handled with patience and discretion, with adults working together to address immediate needs while teaching longer-term lessons about responsibility and behavior. The young prince seemed to thrive under this balanced approach. He was learning that public life required certain sacrifices of spontaneity, but also offered unique opportunities and experiences. He understood that people like Whitfield were there to help keep him safe and guide him toward appropriate behavior, not to restrict his joy or crush his spirit. This understanding was developing gradually, appropriately, with occasional setbacks and leaps forward that characterized normal child development. On the actual anniversary of the Windsor incident, no one marked the occasion formally. Life had moved forward as it always did, bringing new challenges and triumphs that overshadowed previous dramas. Louis attended a school event that morning, played with his siblings that afternoon, and had no particular awareness that exactly 1 year earlier he'd made a spirited dash across a lawn that had briefly captured public attention. Catherine remembered, though. She recalled her embarrassment and concern, her gratitude for Whitfield's quick intervention, her appreciation for Camilla's gracious response. The incident had been minor in the grand scheme of royal life, barely registering compared to genuine crises and challenges the family faced, yet it had mattered in its own way, demonstrating how small moments of kindness, professionalism, and family solidarity could prevent problems and build relationships. Whitfield remembered, too. He thought about that autumn afternoon when he'd made a split-second decision that had somehow altered the trajectory of his career. The intervention had been instinctive, Nothing he'd consciously planned or sought recognition for, yet it had led to unexpected opportunities and relationships. He'd become part of a young prince's life in a small but meaningful way, contributing to the child's sense of security and comfort during public appearances. Camilla reflected on the incident occasionally as well, viewing it as a turning point in her relationship with Catherine. The younger woman's vulnerability in that moment, her very human embarrassment at her child's behavior, had made her more relatable. Camilla's choice to respond with warmth rather than criticism had opened doors to deeper understanding and cooperation. Their relationship would never be simple, given the complex family dynamics and public scrutiny they navigated, but it had become genuinely supportive rather than merely cordial. As evenings settled over London, the various people whose lives had intersected on that autumn afternoon a year earlier went about their separate routines. Louis was tucked into bed after stories and goodnight kisses, his energy finally depleted. Catherine reviewed her schedule for the coming week, mentally preparing for upcoming events and obligations. Camilla enjoyed a quiet dinner with Charles, discussing the day's events and tomorrow's plans. Whitfield completed his shift and headed home, already thinking about the next day's assignments. The moment that had brought them together had been brief and could have been insignificant. A child running, a guard intervening, adults responding with grace. Yet it had rippled outward in unexpected ways, strengthening relationships, building trust, and creating a foundation for ongoing cooperation. In the complex world of royal life, where every gesture carried weight and every interaction faced scrutiny, such moments of authentic human connection held particular value. The story would occasionally resurface in compilations of charming royal moments or in profiles of Prince Louis as he grew older. It would be remembered as a sweet incident demonstrating the challenges and joys of raising children in the public eye. But for those who had actually been there, who had navigated that brief moment of potential disruption and turned it into something positive, the memory held deeper significance. It reminded them that beneath the titles and protocols and public roles, they were all simply people trying to do their best in extraordinary circumstances.